Hey, good morning, everybody. It's another time for us to open our Bibles up together and to dig into the text of James. If you could right now, go ahead and turn to chapter 5. As you're doing that, we're going to have a little time to get to meet Dominic a little bit. One of the things that Terry and I have thoroughly enjoyed in the course of these studies is being introduced to evangelists and servants in the Lord's kingdom who are further from us. And right now, with the social distancing rules, everyone is the same distance from everybody. 6 feet plus whatever speed your internet is. That's basically the standard rule. So, Dominic, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? I know that this is our first digital face-to-face interaction. Where do you stand in the hierarchy of the Venusa clan? Oldest, youngest, middle. I know that's a certain status
The oldest, symbol. The least of these, but the oldest. There's 4 of us boys, and grew up with my uncle as well. So we had a house full of boys.
Awesome. And you're working up in Illinois?
Yeah, Rochelle, Illinois. We've been here about 10 years now.
Awesome. Terry, you doing all right?
Doing great. I just saw Hal Hammond's comment that he needs some good points for James. I would direct him to another broadcast for that. This is more about entertainment than good points, because I don't have any good points. So you're in the wrong place, Hal. Sorry.
Not wrong on all points. What we can do right now...
I will admit that, though, that Dominic is the smarter of the 3 of us. So maybe there will be some today.
It's certainly possible. Bob wants to know how old your microphone is, Dominic. From which era does that come from? I'm kind of a little envious.
It's probably like 10 or 15 years. I don't know.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing right there.
Yeah.
I haven't used a lot of this stuff since back then. I was trying to figure out what works with what and how to get it going.
Yeah.
That's classy.
Yeah, I support that. I probably have to, the longer this case continues, I'll have to see about actually...
Makes me look boring, I got to say. I'm just the old... Yeah, that's classy.
Yeah, appreciate it. Hey, let's go ahead and read some of the text. And actually, we're going to highlight in on just verses 19 and 20. We've spent a bit of a time digging into 13 through 18 in the last conversation we had. And so right now we can kind of really narrow in to verses 19 and 20. Dominic, you want to read that for us?
Mm-hmm. My brothers, if anyone among you wanders from the truth, and someone brings him back, let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins.
Thank you. So what we've got here, again, is a couple of things. There's quite a bit that goes on in the closing refrains of this letter, and we'll kind of bring a few things all in the one package. We're not going to summarize. Maybe we will. We'll see kind of how the pacing goes. But as we mentioned at the beginning of each broadcast, to a certain degree, the text of James is an expanded notes edition of parts of the Sermon on the Mount. It is a reflection or an echo of the teaching of Jesus in a very specific and practical way. You can catch a lot of the illustrations that James uses, a lot of the context that he refers to are very relevant to the northern Galilee area. All the illustrations and images and stuff that he tends to pull in fit that geographic and archaeological context. The specific context of James's letter really hones in on the Christians who are being expelled or pushed or dispersed from Jerusalem, however edge of that conversation you want to look at. And that impacts both the practical side of understanding James, but the deeper, larger tendrils of the message as it grabs root in the story of Christians in the first century. And so that's kind of just a little bit of a summary look at a lot of that. And so with that, let's dig back into the text and pay attention to some of the details. Verse 19, first phrase, my brothers. You'll notice that kind of is a bit of a capstone comment to at least 2 or 3 of the earlier segments where he uses phrases that narrow his audience. When we speak, if I'm speaking specifically to a small segment of Christians, I'll narrow it down to the older, to those in Christ, maybe to those who shepherd local congregations. If I'm talking about believers who may not yet be in Christ yet, I'll say believers. And say that generally, because you can believe but not necessarily have committed to the kingdom. And so I might use that phrase as generics. And so I think there's probably some couple of ways we can think about in this text here about the term brothers. But what do you guys see here? What's going on with that term? What's James's intent as both a conclusion, as both a specific kind of thing? What's going on, Dominic? What you got for us? Terry said you're the smart one, so you got to rise up.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you mentioned it's the term that he uses throughout, and of course, this is the last time. And it does make me think of the first time he used it, where he is first addressing them in trial there in chapter 1, verse 2. And this section has a lot of throwbacks, actually, to the first chapter. And you can think of how far they've come, really, from the beginning chapter to where they are now. He's really not even talking about their own trials here in the end. Whereas before he can even tell them the other stuff, he's got to deal with all the stuff on their mind during the trial and just get them where they need to be before he can then send them to serving others, as he's about to here in these verses.
I think one of the things that stuck out to me was the fact that in the immediate context, it's interesting how that, the last couple of days we focused on the role of shepherds in the area of restoration, in healing. And then now this backs out and really applies it to everybody. And I think one of the things that I take away from this is that while there is this idea here in verses 12 through 18 about shepherds playing an important role in restoration and healing, we all play an important role in restoration and healing. And I think that my brothers kind of funnels back out from that kind of more narrow thing to a much wider audience. It reminds me also of the idea of Galatians, that we bear one another's burdens, that just the fellowship and the community that is expected within the body of Christ, and that we assist each other and that we help each other. We talked a lot about yesterday and even the day before that there's a culture that needs to be kind of created for all of that to happen. And we talked about how part of that is that we reach out to the elders and ask them to do that for us. The other part of that is us being willing to do that for others. And so from that standpoint, I think there's just a lot to be made from that and understand. We just have this responsibility in that sense to help each other out. And that it's not just the elders, lest we kind of get so focused on that and don't realize that from the last couple of days.
Yeah, I think for sure. This is kind of there's a tendril that goes to the text of Galatians that is on one level of this message that where Paul is writing to the church there or to the churches in Galatia and talks about restoration in another picture. Because with each of these instructive texts, I always think of them as painting a picture. And those pictures kind of vary based on the participants. And so when Paul writes in Galatians chapter 6 about basically some of the same stuff, his focus is a little bit narrowed again, because in both of these restoration portraits, the audience shifts. In the James one, you think about who he's going to be writing to. These are the Christians who were from Judea, from Jerusalem, who would have kind of spanned the gamut in their backgrounds. Some of them were wealthy, some were coming from the Sanhedrin, some were Pharisees, some were Sadducees, some were tax gatherers, but all of them had that shared spiritual baggage of being part of Israel, part of cultural Israel and physical Israel, and now they're going out to ones who would have had less. They certainly would have had less connection to physical Israel, less connection to the theological aspects of Israel, because of the farther you got from the core, the less tied you were to those things, historically speaking. And yet, who's he talking to? Like, who's the restored bunch is my first, like, one of my thoughts. Like, who's going to be restored? And where were they restored from? Because this is not bringing someone back to Israel. It's bringing him into spiritual Israel from having already been there. I think there's certain levels of that are important for us in the right now. One of the things that Eastside has been doing, I've been doing as an evangelist, our elders have done together, our congregation has been together, is to reach out to prior participants in the local work and check on them. investigate and say, hey, what's going on? Are you okay? Can we serve you? I think that's something that's really a great 21st century parallel to a first century text, is to engage in that way. What else do you guys see in here, especially as we move into verse 22? Because there's some pictures there that I think are really important. We talk about it in verse 20 with an angel rejoicing when one sinner repents and turns back. This one has a different illustration. And I want to see maybe what we can kind of see in the picture of covering a multitude of sins. Because I know that I've heard that used in various ways in Bible studies, in congregational conversations. So Terry, what do you see there in verse 20? And we'll move around our little tripod horn here in a second. Dominic can jump in after that.
Well, let me say this to touch on what you said, maybe to back up, and then one of the things that hit my mind too that I wanted to say is when we think about evangelism, we typically restrict evangelism to conversions from non-Christians to Christians, and that's how we define it. But I think this is an evangelistic passage that needs to point out to us that evangelism is not just converting people who've never been Christians to being Christians, but going out to those, like you said, who have been have drifted away for whatever reason. If we can go out and we can bring them back, that also is evangelism. And this idea of salvation in verse 20 is important to see. This is about saving somebody. And you can save somebody by teaching them the gospel for the first time, or you can save somebody by restoring them back to the life that they left willfully. And both are equally important. And I think sometimes because of, quite frankly, the emphasis that is placed on baptism, that we just, and admittedly, there's an emotional reaction to that is understandable. I don't want to downplay that. But we need to see the restoration of a lost brother as something that is as powerful and as much reason to celebrate as somebody who's becoming a brother through baptism. I mean, the parable of the lost son shows us this need to really focus on the desire for our brother to return home. And I do wonder about the tie-in to that. And I think sometimes we may not be the angry brother who is angry that somebody came home. I'm not saying that directly in this text, but I think sometimes we could be the brother that's just apathetic about whether anybody does.
Yeah.
And this passage reminds us that this is an important thing, and we should be about this, of out trying to bring the wandering back. And I just think that needs to be pointed out.
Dominic?
Along with, I had two things. One with what Terry said there about it being evangelism. This is one of the ties to chapter 1 verbally, where in chapter 1, verse 20, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God, therefore put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. This idea of this word of the truth that saves souls, that's what we receive when we come into this community of Jesus people. And then that's what they're returning to Terry's point, that it's the same truth that we received at the beginning that we need to keep using to bring each other back. The second thing was, I forget now. It wasn't related to Terry's comment. Oh, that's right. Yeah, in the context, about the historical context, how important this spiritual danger still is, even though they have very immediate pressing dangers. That doesn't mean that the concern for spiritual well-being goes away or goes to the side. It's actually the thing he ends with is do whatever you need to be doing, even though you may have what feel like more immediate pressing needs. You still need to watch out for each other's spiritual well-being.
Yeah,
Hey, Phil, I wanted to interject Michael Walls' comment right now, because I think it really is fitting. All the comments are great, and we'll get to all of them. But Michael said, I imagine that due to the trials and such James refers to at the beginning of the book, many people have left the faith when things got tough, like the parable of the sower. And I think that's a great tie-in, that those who had their faith tested, some of them did not endure. And I think there's a tie-in back to that there's a responsibility to try to go back to those who didn't endure and try to restore them. I think that's a great thought. And let me say this about the parable of the sower. I've heard people kind of use the parable of the sower as an excuse not to do what James 5:19-20 is saying. It's almost like, well, hey, look, there's 4 kinds of soil. My job is just to sow the seed, and when it happens, they're the soil they are, and that's it. I can't control that. And all I got to say is sometimes you can keep sowing and change the soil you're sowing in because you keep sowing.
Yep.
Don't write somebody off because they're in the thorns for a moment, and just walk away from them and surrender them to the thorns. Try to keep working to change them into good soil. And I think that's a danger of that parable that maybe we give into as well.
I forget I don't remember who this was from, but I was reading somebody recently who was pointing out that Peter fits more than one of the categories of the parable of the sower throughout the Gospel of Matthew. When the times of trial comes, he breaks. But then, like you said, through continued ministry, he's brought along.
So Michael West brings up a good question too. I want to throw in there, and Terry, you can maybe weave this in there. He says, "How do you deal with the attitude of when they say, 'I know what you're going to tell me. I've heard it before'?" I've got a couple of answers, but I do think Peter's life and the patience of Jesus in dealing with that is a starting point to figuring out what do I do.
So let me say that I just wanted to add in, that whole in Corinth that Paul and the idea of planting and watering, I think fits into that soil process that sometimes you plant, and then you got to keep watering and tending to get it. God gives the increase, but somebody's got to keep working the ground. And just to add that in, as to Michael's West's question, I think we see that as a roadblock. To me, that's not a roadblock, because if they come in and go, "Okay, I know what you're going to tell me," then I just go, "All right, well then let's talk about why you're not doing it." Because if you know it already, then knowledge is not the problem. Then I don't need to tell you what you need to do. What's going on? And I think sometimes we go into those situations wanting to tell somebody what to do when they already know, when maybe what needs to be done is us spend the time saying, what's the real problem? And I tell you what I mean by that. Sometimes the real problem is not what everybody thinks the real problem is. And it takes a little work to dig down and get to the real problem. And if all we do is go preach to somebody about how they need to do this or this is going to happen, we don't take the time to dig deeper and get to the real problem with them, then we're really just dealing with symptoms and not the true issue. So in those cases, like I said, and somebody tells me that, my response to them is, great. We can skip that 30 minutes, right? And now we can get into the real depth of what we need to talk about, which is, if you know this already, then what's going on? Why are we here? And that's just always been my approach when that comes up.
Has your guys' experience been, I feel like the times that I've heard that, what is it that you think they think you're going to say? Because my experience has been usually when they say that, they're thinking primarily in terms of their obligations and what they're supposed to be doing, and how much we need them at church or that sort of thing. But if what you're talking about is the cross, how do you casually go, "Oh yeah, I already know about that cross stuff"? It's hard to imagine someone thinking that.
Generally attendance, right? Let's be honest. It's generally like, you're going to tell me I need to be at church.
Right.
It's like, well, okay, so let's set that aside. What's really going on? Like, why are you? So that's the idea of getting deeper. All right. So if you know you need to be there and you're not, why are you really not there? Like, what's really the issue?
So I'll give an illustration to this too. I think of different approaches to it. Terry's answer is the classic extrovert preacher answer.
Sure.
We immediately skip to the end of the thing and say, well, let's get down to work. There's another couple ways to think about it. First thing is to realize that attitude and statement, and I've heard it before too, is generally just a response. It's not actually conviction, feeling, or whatever. That's just like, I'm going to say this so you leave me alone. So my first mental response is, I'm going to tell them something different. Say it a different way. Kind of like what Dominic was hinting at. If they think I'm going to talk about attendance expectations, I'll talk about commitment in Jehovah, or I'll talk about Jesus, or I'll actually do my third level thing, which is not an Emerson reference at all, with his next level whatever. I will actually talk about anything else. One of the things that I've been doing when I check on the congregation at Eastside is I ask them, what did you do today? Because it's kind of relevant to staying in the cage that we live in. Because I genuinely want to know what they did today for a number of reasons. I want to know because they maybe have done something that I should be doing. I want to know because I care about them. I want to know because I want them to share their life with me like I want to share my life with them. So if you're going to someone who is identified contextually as your brother, my brothers, and encouraging them to go find a wanderer and bring them where? Home, in essence. The wanderers have left wherever home is and you're bringing it back. You've got to invest in them. And that involves, some of the practicalities, attendance, service, all that stuff. That's low order things. It's about reconciliation between two people who weren't getting along. And it may have been you and them, but it more importantly is them and the kingdom of God. Whether Jesus specifically, God generally, or any of those things. And so you got to figure out how to comfortably listen and not be awkward. Well, those are really hard things, to be fair. Like, all that's hard. No, that's like, oh, that's so easy. It sounds great. There's a lot of challenge in that.
Well, Phil, in the Beckley account, I never know which one it is. I'm assuming maybe Tim.
99% of the time it's Tim.
Yeah, it says compassion first, and absolutely. And I would add connection. And I would tell you, a lot of times I don't get that response. And a lot of it was because when I was, I spent a summer in Nashville working at Riverside Drive, which is no longer in existence, sadly. But there was an elder there named Kenneth Dallas, who was Kenneth was just a mechanic. That's all he was. He was not an educated man. He was not somebody you would look at and go, man, that guy's the smartest guy I've ever met, kind of thing. But he was really, really wise. And when I was there, for the time I was there, I spent every Thursday night with him and his wife, and we would eat dinner together. And then he and I would load up in their car that was reserved for Sunday morning and the visiting. And we would drive to somebody's house and we would visit with them. And a lot of times it was these kind of cases. And what Kenneth would do is we'd go in and we'd just talk. We wouldn't talk about church or anything else. We'd just sit there and talk, sometimes for 30 minutes, about anything. And Kenneth would find a way to connect to them. Maybe it was what they were doing. Maybe it was their job. Maybe it was sports. Maybe it was gardening. He found a way to connect to every single person in the process of that. And we'd sit there and talk, and we'd be laughing and cutting up. And then he'd just slide in his very country accent, somewhere along the way, well, we just want you to know we've been missing you and we love you. And every time, nobody ever came back with, I know what you're going to say, because there was such compassion and connection at that point that there was, the defensive side was gone. And his approach was not, here's what you need to do, but we miss you. And I think there's something to that, by the way, in that approach. And so I would say, I would add that to the mix, and maybe we never get to that point. I think the message too is Dominic said, and even as you said, that's when this happens, it's usually to try to get around this. But I think it's just because we start off with the wrong message, which is, why aren't you at church? When the real message is, hey, I want a relationship with you. I want to be your brother, and I miss you. And I think that's just so much more powerful than maybe the approach of, hey, you need to be at church.
Yeah. I think Tara and I have used this illustration before. You go to the grocery store, you see a wayward brother. The gut response is to go somewhere else by many brethren, and myself at times. And the appropriate response is, if they're buying arugula, you're buying arugula today.
Yeah.
You know,
and I don't even know what arugula is. Right? But hey, here's the thing about that, especially in the case of church discipline, that's our thing is, oh no, there's John Doe. He's been marked. I can't talk to him.
Yeah.
And if that's the way you respond, I want you to know that you are the Levite and the priest in the story of the Good Samaritan. Yeah. But here's somebody who's been spiritually beat up. They're on the side of the road, and you go to the other side of the street to avoid them.
Right.
And that's just, we need to make that application. That when we see those folks, we need to go to them, and our message to them is, I love you and I miss you. That's our message. Not, hey, you're a sinner, you need to repent and get back in church. Because if that's your approach, they're not going to do it. I promise you that.
I had a thought I was going to ask you guys about and bring up.
Sure.
That's not exactly on what was just said, but reminded me of it.
So let's go.
Okay. He mentioned church discipline, and you guys have been noting all along how James is constantly going back to the teachings of Jesus. And so it's not hard to imagine that he has Matthew 18 in mind, at least as one of the teachings of Jesus about how to bring a brother back. And I was thinking about, I didn't think about it until preparing for this, the idea of in a time of trial, a church still, I can imagine a church not wanting to go through some of those steps when there's already persecution potentially, famine potentially, dispersion, whatever it is. I can imagine those sorts of things seeming like, what should you even be doing that right now or not? And is James saying that's still part of what we need to be doing even in the times of distress? Do you have thoughts on that?
I do. Quite a few of them. There's a lot of struggles with that. And I don't want to co-opt the cultural context of what we're struggling with as a nation in America or other nations too, with this essential, unessential activity. But you kind of narrow it down. In the end, in times of difficulty, you really have two options. You could either try to go it alone and fail, or build a crew and succeed. That's pretty much a historical fact when it comes to strain and stress. The more isolated you are, the weaker you are. So in this process of reconciliation, we tended to think of the negative outcomes with the Jesus model, Matthew 18, with the Paul model, 1 Corinthians, when the negative outcomes are actually the least desired outcome. The desired outcome is that at step one, when you go meet them, you have a real reconciliation. In order to accomplish that, the person who is going has to bring their entire box of humility with them. When you go with two or more, the persons who are going need to bring twice as much humility with them. Even if you bring it to the church, it still has to be a deep, humbling moment, because it's some part in the process. This is the way that my present understanding of it kind of matches, is it's a failed marriage. And the failure isn't just on the wayward adulterer. The failure is on the faithful who stayed home. And so I think with each of those steps, with each of those edges in the conversation, it's then important for us to approach it with the desire of reconciliation is what we want. Now, I say that because many times we've moved those conversations all the way down to the end of the matter, and we do it all in a week. I wrote you a letter. You didn't respond to my letter. 2 weeks later, 2 men knocked on your door, and you didn't answer the door, and so we withdrew from you. None of those
By the
are
way,
biblical
where did this
models.
letter process come up? That's one of the things I've always wondered about. I have my thoughts, but I don't remember reading about, hey, contact somebody through written correspondence so you have a written record of what happened.
All right, I have thoughts. We can save that for another conversation.
Yeah.
And most of them probably belong in the dumpster fire of judges. Let's just throw them there.
But here's one of the problems, I think, is we read Matthew 18 from a judge's perspective rather than an arbitration perspective. And what I mean by that is, even as the witnesses, we go into that thinking to ourselves, okay, this person is wrong because this person asked me to go. And I'm just a witness that when this person doesn't automatically repent, then we can go tattletale to the eldership about what happened in the story. The picture of a marriage is great. My wife and I do premarital counseling together, and we've done some counseling together. Now, we're not licensed or trained. When things, just to be clear, when things get to a certain point, there's references made, okay, to more trained professionals. So I want to clear that up. But I tell you what's interesting is almost every time you deal with a married couple that's having problems, regardless of what's involved, they both come loaded in with why it's not their fault, right? And what they expect you to do, and especially in the case where there may be some infidelity or something along those lines that is more of a sinful nature than the other, they come in with this expectation the same way that your job here in this story is to judge my mate and tell them they need to repent, and it's all their fault. And here's a little secret that's not that much of a secret. Like, even in the cases of infidelity, it's not 100% that person's fault. I mean, they sinned. That's another thing. But there's a lot of things that led to that sin. And I'm not saying, and I know a lot of people get really, really defensive. You're saying no, that I'm not saying that the person who was not unfaithful is guilty of a sin. But we need to understand that relationship wise, that there needs to be a coming together. And a friend of mine used to be for a living, he was an arbitrator negotiator. And he told me that in every successful negotiation, both sides lose. And that you go into the approach knowing that both sides are to an extent going to have to give something up for peace to be met, for reconciliation to occur. And I think that's one of the things we don't understand. And I think there's this idea throughout Scripture of personal sacrifice. And in the case of trying to restore a relationship with our brother, who this has happened with, there may be some things where we have to come towards them in order to restore them. That does not mean that we accept things that are sinful. That does not mean that we endorse things that are sinful. But it may mean that we acknowledge, hey, look, yes, you did this, it was sinful, but we didn't handle this the right way. And I want to talk to you about that, and maybe understand that, hey, look, I realize I didn't handle this the right way. I want to handle it the right way now. That's part of coming together. So I think there's just some of that goes in. And sometimes I got to tell you, sometimes when you go into these cases and there's witnesses, sometimes the point is, hey, you both are wrong. Both of you have things that you've done that are sinful. And I just think that needs to be pointed out and understand the point of this is not judgment and discipline. The real goal here is reconciliation. That's the real goal. Reconciliation to God and to each other. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that because we want to win the fight rather than be reconciled to our brother and have the relationship restored.
So what you guys both, I heard in both of what you said is, the aim is reconciliation, which makes our community stronger in the first place. And you see that in James, and you guys both talked about adultery. Of course, he calls them adulteresses, which is not the most comforting language in times of trial, and a cyclical letter just calling everybody adulteresses. But by the end, he's assuming that those people that he's called that are going to be with him in the work of bringing back others. So sometimes, these things that might not seem helpful in a trial, if we're committed to reconciliation, should help us.
Absolutely.
I was thinking about it this way, and this is another way to picture the same painting on the wall of desiring to bring the wanderer back. Sometimes we picture the shepherds of a local church going to meet the wayward as if it is, like Terry pointed out, a judicial scene where judgment is taking place. And the conversation is, toward the wayward, you failed us. That's the way it's perceived. It doesn't mean that's the heart between any of it, but that's the perception. What if we changed the table and the conversation became seen as the shepherds go to the wayward and say, we failed you. We're sorry. How can we bring you back into the fold? That's humility rather than judgment. It takes a dispensing of all the pretenses of what we think shepherds look like. But what would be the outcome? How would that change the nature of a flock? How would that change the nature of these disciples who are being dispersed abroad and everywhere? If that was their change. The humility that comes through the pressure cooker of challenge can refine in a great way, and you can end up with a much stronger body, across the board. And that's just something to think about. That's one of those paintings that you can picture and say, okay, who do I fit? Who do I want to fit? Just like the classic Last Supper. Which of those souls next to the image of one man's idea of what Jesus looked like? Who am I? Am I leaning in? Am I leaning out? Etc. I would much rather be seen as the shepherd who comes to the sheep and brings them back, no matter what the cost to me personally, than the one who looked at the sheep far off and said, he's good on his own. Anyway.
So Phil, we kind of ignored your question earlier, so we have like a minute and a half, or we could go.
That's normal, by the way.
The save a soul from death and cover a multitude of sins. Why don't you answer that question, or at least get us started quickly?
Open it up real quickly. I think sometimes we tend to over-literalize Old Testament and New Testament texts, and we think about them as mathematical equations. And so we see this phrase, and we say, okay, this is going to cover all their past sins. Boom, done. And we think about it in a personalized sense as a first layer. They're going to cover all those sins. Where I think holistically, there's an image here that is more tied to the Old Testament theology of the redemptive process of sins and the covering of sins in that sense than just a mathematical A plus B equals C sense, especially if you tie it to the teaching of Jesus and Jesus specifically. At least on a theological level. I'm not going to say my catchphrase. I said it twice yesterday. I can't say it today. But Terry could say it.
Theology goes to the garden.
Right. The story of the redemption of man is so wound into Jesus, and his story begins there. And it's about bringing all of those things back together. So for me, the cross and the resurrected Son of God is really what is being emphasized by this statement, more so than the mechanics of, there you go, you covered up some sin, bro, good work. You're part of the team now. This has more to do with weaving them back into the family of God and drawing that last picture, because this is the last thing he's saying to them. This is his last sentence that we know of that he says to these Christians. And so there's a picture there that he's wanting to really be the last thing that they think about. It's the invitation. It's like, what do you want to remember from your sermon? What do you want to talk about at lunch today? That's the first thing I see, at least.
Dominic?
Yeah, I don't think I have anything specific to add to that.
I agree. I think it's interesting that I think we could read this from a very self-centric view, as you kind of alluded to, Phil, of look what I did. I saved a guy. I covered his sins, and you didn't. I think of this more the idea that it goes back to relationships in the passage. Like if you had the ability to save somebody from drowning, wouldn't you do it? I remember in Romans when Paul talks about if he could, he would give up himself for his brothers. And I think it's that mentality that should drive us here. Not that, and Paul knows that's impossible, but what that passage is really talking about is Paul's desire for those, his kinsmen and those he loves, to be saved. And I think this points that, as you said, the idea here is the connection to the cross and to Jesus, and that bringing them back to the Lord. I often think of this covers a multitude of sins as not just past tense, but if you can help bring somebody and restore the relationship with the Lord, that has the potential to cover past, present, and future, right? I mean, that Jesus can cover all of those sins if they continue to be faithful, and we play an important role in that. And I think that's one of the things we miss. We talked about a lot about relationships today, but our relationships, actual relationships with each other, plays an important role in helping each other in this sense. The brotherhood and the fellowship is an important part of us serving the Lord. That's why we, according to Hebrews 10, that's why we come together, is to encourage each other. Our relationships help each other continue to be faithful. I think it's interesting that in the idea of discipline, as we talked about, that's what's pulled away as a consequence, because that should be a motivation. Of course, sadly, I think today there's no relationship there to miss, and that's why it doesn't work. But your relationships play an important part. So this isn't saying here that you're saving somebody necessarily, but your relationship you extend to them plays an important role in them, in their devotion to the Lord. And then the Lord is the saving factor in all of that.
It does remind me of First Peter. Not that James is aware of First Peter 4, but the love covers a multitude of sins there, which maybe could be Peter expanding on that here. That what you guys are saying about the relational part.
So a couple of things. Gail Edward has a great question comment. We always want to blame. There's enough blame to go on both sides. How do you learn to accept blame and move forward? And so we'll use that as our last question before we go into our Around the Horn, announce what's going on, and talk about all the things that are coming up in the future for each of us. So tips for accepting blame and moving forward. Terry, I know that you've thought about this quite a bit. Dominic, if you want to jump in, you can. So Terry, what would be some of the things you would think about as a suggestion to others?
Well, so go back to the marriage arena. When we work with couples, what they want to focus on is blame, and we very quickly try to show them that blame is not what we should focus on. That playing the blame game doesn't heal. A lot of times too, that blame comes with the question of why. And one of the things we talk about early on is, especially in the case where there's just sin like infidelity, No, no answer to the question why is going to get you to accept that, right? And so we move on and talk about what grace looks like and forgiveness and the need to forgive rather than blame, and the need that we all want forgiveness rather than blame. And then we focus on that, and especially in a marriage, I think this is key. When you look at the text in marriage, while we spend a lot of times pointing fingers at the other party for the reasons of the problems in our marriage, the scriptures always focus on yourself. So husbands, you play your role regardless of whether or not your wife is following what God says. And wives, you do what you're instructed to do, regardless of whether or not your husband's doing what he's expected to do. And we try to get off of the blame game and into the self-evaluation and realize that what's more important than me blaming and finding a justification for what I've done is realizing here's what I've done that I need to change, because that actually stands in the way, especially in marriage, by the way, stands in the way of my eternity if I'm not fulfilling my part. So you just got to realize the blame game is a paralyzing discussion. And as long as you stay in that, in any case, as long as you focus on blame, you will never move forward to any amount of change and improvement and maturity. And so it's hard. That's a hard thing. And as Phil talked about earlier, I'll say this, it takes a lot of humility to move past the blame game. The blame game is very centric focused, and that's part of the issue.
In the language of James, along with what Terry was saying, is in times of difficulty and trial, you are often trying to get what's fair, and because it's what you think you need to be full. But what he's been saying in James is when you are lacking, it's not the stuff we get from down here that we will be filled with or mature in. It's the wisdom from above. And so that key section of James 3:13 through 18, make us complete, isn't what we get and fighting and the blame stuff. It's the wisdom from above that is others focused, the wisdom of the cross. That's what completes us. So even if we were interested in ourselves, the way we find completeness isn't what we get from down here. It's what we get from above and then live out toward others.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Mason, another one of the clone bros, I say that just because your voices, I've heard a number of you guys speak in different contexts, have very similar tones to them. Jesus endured all the accusations on the cross. I think there's an endurance aspect of it that's important to bring in, and thanks, Mason, for listening and adding that to the dialogue.
And Phil, real quick on that line, we talk all the time about being willing to suffer for the cause of Christ, but then the blame game is really a form of trying to avoid suffering, or try to, you know what I mean by that? Like, we don't want to make it something that we just accept and move on. Sometimes that is what we have to do in those cases, is sacrifice a little bit of ourselves, suffer in the case to move on. I think that's just one of the things to keep in mind.
So we are close to the close time here. Let's go ahead and go around the horn a little bit and highlight a few things. Terry, what's going on? Anything we need to be aware of? Last comments?
First off, thanks, Dominic. We haven't met till today. Really enjoyed our time together, and followed some of your comments and had a little bit about your work, and really, really thankful for guys like you and that join us in this work, and just pray that God continues to bless you in that up in Rochelle. Tomorrow is going to be a little bit of a different day for us. We've got a bunch of college kids joining us, including my son and Phil's son, and that should be interesting. And if nothing else, especially in the case of my son, there's no telling what will be said tomorrow, so entertainment value will be exponentially greater than today. So we encourage you to join in tomorrow.
For sure. Dominic?
I also enjoyed being with you guys. Appreciate the cool kids letting the introverts join in.
Only one of those things was true.
Is this the self-promotion part? Is that what this is supposed to be?
Yeah, or? You can if you would like. You can if you would like.
Just during this whole virus stuff, I've been posting videos. So at our Rochelle Church of Christ Facebook page on Mondays. That I don't know if that'll go forward, but for now we have that.
Awesome. Yeah, this is, you can certainly promote things. There's no, we do not release our Cash App information. We do not put out all those things. I joke about it constantly because it's hilarious to me because we're all televangelists at this point, and that's like a cliche move. But no, this is a good.
We are televangelists with faces made for radio. That's the bad part.
Oh, the spirit's pretty good. The spirit's pretty good. I think I'll be meeting with my style consultant later and working on some facial activities. She's got some plans for me. Hallie will have some stuff going on. Maybe I'll post a picture. We'll see. But like Terry said, I really want to encourage people to get ready for tomorrow's study. It's from the text of Philippians. Unlike the cliche, we are not going to be asking these young college kids to talk about 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. We've got a challenging text for them to grapple with from chapter 3 of Philippians, around verses 17 through 21. I think they'll do a good job. It'll be neat to see their perspective to a text that is important for all of us. Dominic, thanks for coming. I know that for a lot of things like this, it's really stretching the comfort level of everybody, especially those of us who aren't really used to radio media, video media stuff. It's different, and I really appreciate you doing that and your insights today. For everybody else, thank you so much for joining. Thank you for your great comments, your great conversation. And then from this point forward, as always, our prayer and desire is that you would seek God and find the redemption that's found in His Son. If we can serve you in some way, please let us know. And we do pray regularly that God blesses you in every way that He chooses. Take care.